As I look through all the comments on my past YouTube videos, I find a ton of questions in there that I think deserve answers, but aren't quite big enough to make a full video out of. So in this video, what I decided to do was combine about 10 of those questions into one video, and we're gonna go through some explanation as well as some demos on how to do a few neat tips and tricks. So if you're interested in picking up something new today, stick around and let's dive into these questions and answers. One that's come up a ton of times is making a sticky sidebar. I actually made a video on this a while back, but since Generate Blocks has changed and added the Flexbox controls inside of the editor, the way we need to set this up changes a little bit. So for demonstration, I went ahead and just set up a pretty simple blog post layout. We have our title up here, our content on this side, and we have this little sidebar that we want to be sticky when we scroll down the screen. So there's just a couple things we need to do here, and then we need to add just a little bit of CSS to make this work. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop open the list view here so you can see everything. We're in the second container here where our content is. And inside of it, we have a grid with two different containers. This first container is all the blog content on the left, and the right container is where this sidebar lives. Now there's an important thing we need to do here first. We need to think of this second container here as the track that the sticky element is going to scroll up and down on. Inside of the track, we need the actual sticky element. So if you're gonna do a setup like this where you have like an entire box that's gonna be sticky, you actually need to add another box inside that container. So you can see here where I have this white box, it's its own container inside this track. And that's really important to get this set up and working correctly. So the first thing we're gonna do is go to this track container, and we're gonna scroll down here until we find the sizing. Inside the sizing, we're gonna set a minimum height of 100%. So I typed in a percent key there and it changed this value to percent. Now when I hover over this, you'll see that that track is going all the way down the entire height of its parent. When I didn't have that in there and I hover over it, you can see it's only as tall as its contents inside of it. So we need that to be set to 100%. And that's gonna allow this track to span the entire height of its parent and the sticky element to slide along with it. All right, the next thing we need to do is grab our actual sticky element and give it a class. So under the Advanced tab, I'm gonna go to Additional CSS Classes, and I'm just gonna type sticky for the purposes of this demo. We'll go ahead and hit Update. We'll view this on the front end. And as we can see, nothing's sticky yet. So we gotta jump into the customizer and write just a little bit of CSS. We're gonna use that same selector, which was sticky. We'll open our braces, and we're gonna do position sticky. Then we have to give it where we want it to stick. So it needs some kind of coordinates. So for this, I'm gonna say top, and I'm gonna do to rim. This is gonna prevent it from sticking to the very top of the browser. It's gonna give it a little bit of margin. So with those instructions in there, now if we scroll on this page, we'll see that sidebar is sticking perfectly at the top. And when we get outside of this section, it stops sticking. You can see it just sticks right there to the bottom. As we scroll up, obviously it sticks again. So you can change with these values. Like I said, if we just put 0 here, it's actually gonna stick to the top of the browser, which doesn't usually look the best. So going with just a little bit of space there is a little bit nicer. And just like that, we have a sticky sidebar. A question I get quite often is, can you show me how to do X, Y, or Z inside of WooCommerce? And to be honest, I really can't because I simply do not use WooCommerce. Now, I've done some WooCommerce sites in the past, and I actually manage one WooCommerce site right now. But for me, I just do not enjoy working in WooCommerce. It's really complex and technical, and I find myself always trying to put out fires and debug issues. So for me, I really just try to avoid taking on any of those kinds of projects. I know GeneratePress and Generate Blocks do have some WooCommerce controls, but I honestly couldn't tell you anything about them. One user asked how we can make a button download a file instead of opening it up in a new tab. So if we take a look at this page I've set up, I've got a button down here at the bottom that says download PDF. And I've actually linked that to a PDF file that I've set up inside of my media library. We'll go ahead and save this and see how it behaves by default. So by default, when I click this button, it's gonna open up the new tab. I did set it to open up in a new tab, but it's just gonna open up the PDF inside of my browser. Now, a lot of times that might be what you want. People can save it here, but in some situations, you actually want people to download the file. And that's actually really easy to do. So we'll jump inside the editor here, And with our button selected, we'll scroll down to the bottom here where we find attributes. It's under the Advanced tab. If we hit Add Attribute, in this first field here, we can just type in download. We'll go ahead and hit Update. We'll refresh this here. And now when we click that button, you can see it went directly into my downloads. This is just using the custom attributes that are built into Generate Blocks Pro. And if you click on this allowed attributes, you'll see the different kind of attributes you can add to any of your elements. Download is listed on here, and it's an easy little trick to set up buttons or any kind of link to download a file when the user clicks it. Here recently, I got a question about if I'm still using CPTUI now that Advanced Custom Fields allows you to build custom post types right inside their plugin. And although I've just started testing building out custom post types with ACF, I probably will go that direction. I haven't run into any limitations yet, and eliminating one plugin from my stack is always a good thing in my book. CPTUI has been great this whole time, but if I can just have one plugin to manage the post types and the custom fields, I'll probably just go that route. Making cards equal heights is something that's come up time and time again. Now, the way you set this up can change from situation to situation, but what I've set up here for a demo is a pretty common layout you might see, and I'm going to show you the principles of how you'll make all these cards equal heights, and then you can adapt that to whatever your situation is. So let's pop open the list view and take a look at what we got. Here we have our container, our inner container. Inside of it is a grid, and inside the grid is 3 columns. The height of the columns is actually set by the content that's in it. You can see this first one has about 6 lines of text, this one has 1 less, and this one has 1 more. And that results in all these cards having a different height. What we want to do is make all the cards have an equal height. So what we're going to do is select all 3 of our containers, which we can do by clicking the first one, holding Shift, and clicking the last one. This will apply whatever changes we're doing to all 3 containers at one time. The first thing we're going to do is change the display from default to flex. Now you're going to see that makes everything go a little wonky here, but we can change that by changing the flex direction to column. That will put everything back similar to how we had it before, other than you can see these buttons are spanning the whole width. To fix that, we'll just set the align items to flex start, and that will push everything back to how we had it at the very beginning. Obviously, this didn't fix our problem, but this sets us up to be able to fix it. Again, we're going to select all 3 of the containers, and we're going to scroll down here till we find the tab for sizing. Under the height, we want to go with a minimum height of 100%. So again, I just typed in the percentage key, and it changed this value to percent. Now, if we click off of this, we can see all 3 of our cards are the same exact height. Now, in a situation like this, you might want all of your buttons to line up at the very bottom of these cards, no matter how tall the card is. And that's easy to do as well. We can click on this first button here, and under margin, for the top margin, we're just going to type in auto. And we'll do that for all 3 of the buttons. And now, no matter how tall our cards get, this last item is going to be pushed all the way down to the bottom of the card. So you can use this on all kinds of different concepts. This is a pretty typical layout, but you'll see how you can just change things to flex, the flex direction to column, and then once you set that height to 100%, you have a lot more control over making things equal heights. Every video where I magically insert a bunch of lorem ipsum text, I always get the question about how I did that. And I actually do this and a whole lot of other things using an application called TextExpander. Let's take a look at how it works. I've set up TextExpander to do all kinds of shortcuts for me. The one you see in my videos most often is when I type in period WI1, which will give me 1 line of website ipsum. I can also type in WI5, and this will give me 5 paragraphs of website ipsum. This is just one case I'm using TextExpander for, but if I open up TextExpander, you'll see I have hundreds of different snippets I've already set up. One thing that's handy is having all your email addresses where you can type a quick little shortcode and it will spit out your email address. I've even set up entire sections inside of Generate Blocks and different layouts. For example, if I just go in here and type /SEC for section and expand it, it will go ahead and give me a container, an inner container, and it will set up using my global styles for the padding inside of that container. This is really handy for shortcutting things, and I have an entire video on how I'm using TextExpander with Generate Blocks, which should be popping up now if you want to take a look. I've also set this up for some things like writing media queries. So for example, I'm just going to pop a code block in here. If you were writing some CSS to write a media query, you have to remember @media and then max width, all that kind of stuff. And I often forget and end up having to Google it. So I've set up some here. If I just type in .mobile and expand it, it will go ahead and write the media query for me and put my cursor inside the curly brackets so I can just go right away and start writing my code. So here under my generic ones, I have these media queries set up. So what I did in here was just added a new snippet. I pasted in how I wanted my media query to be formatted, and I used one of their macros here to position the cursor here once the TextExpander snippet has been expanded. Down here, you can give it a label. This is just your label that you see inside the list, and then you can give it an abbreviation. Mine for this case is mobile. Now you'll see I typed a period before it because everything inside this group of snippets, I've used a period as the start of my snippet. So this keeps you from accidentally expanding snippets. If you just type the word mobile, I have to type period mobile. Of course, you don't have to use periods. You could set up anything you want, but it does really help you categorize different snippets. I use this thing every day, all day. So if you're looking for something like this, Mac does have some default versions in their operating system. There's also Alfred that does something similar, but I really like the way TextExpander has this with the different macros like positioning the cursor, or you can even set up things to have fill-in text. To give you an example of the fill-in blanks, I have the magic email set up here. So if I go ahead and expand that, it will pop open a little modal where I can type in the customer's name and I can type in their project title and go ahead and hit OK. And it will fill in those blanks with whatever I put inside of the fill in the blank section. So this is really handy for emails that you end up writing over and over again. Like I said, I use TextExpander for all kinds of things. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of GeneratePress and GenerateBlocks, but there are things about both of these plugins that I wish were different. A huge one on my list right now is having the ability to type in different units inside of all of the settings inside of GenerateBlocks. For instance, I would love to be able to use rim for my typography inside of GenerateBlocks, but that's still not a possibility. I'm told it's coming, but we shall see. Another thing which you'll see later on in this video is the ability to use CSS grid inside of GenerateBlocks. This is something that's now coming to Elementor. Bricks users and Oxygen users have had it for a while, and it really is great for making some layouts, and I prefer it over using Flexbox or the grid block in using some of these big macro layouts. I also found out recently that inside the GeneratePress theme, when you add padding settings to anything inside GeneratePress, it's actually adding them inside the inner container. I'd really like those on my outer containers, but trying to do that inside GenerateBlocks and then dealing with the repercussions of how it's all on the inside containers inside of GeneratePress is something that's a really big struggle. So I've just ended up putting all the padding inside of my inner containers. It's really a minute thing, but in my estimation, I think it should be on the outside, but it's too hard to fight against it, so I just have to go with how it's set up now. A lot of the questions I get are about design, so I'm going to show you one little trick right here. So this is a pretty common layout where you might have a button down here with an arrow next to it, but one little trick I like to do to make this a little bit fancier and more interactive is animate this arrow. And what I've been doing lately is going down here to effects and applying a couple different effects. The first one is transform. So we're going to head and toggle that on and hit the wrench icon and add a transform. What we want to do is choose translate. We want the device to be all, the state to be normal, and the target to be the icon. And I'm actually going to translate this icon over about 12 pixels to the left, which is -12. And you can see it's kind of overlapping here now. I'm going to add another transform, and I'm going to do translate. The state's going to be hover this time. And again, I'm going to choose icon. Now I want to translate this to 0x position. So now when I hover over it, you see it moves. But of course, we don't want this arrow overlapping. So I'm going to go into opacity, turn it on, add an effect. And on all devices, the state is normal. I'm going to change the target to icon, and I'm going to change the opacity to 0. I'm going to add another effect and change this time to hover, icon, and leave the opacity at 1. So now you can see there's no icon there, but when I hover over it, it's in the right position and it's opaque. The last thing we need to do is add a transition so this animates nicely. We'll go ahead and turn on our transition, hit the wrench, and we're gonna go ahead and change the target to icon. We can leave the timing function as ease, but you can change that to whatever you want. And I'm gonna change the duration to maybe 0.3 seconds. Go ahead and hit close. And now when I hover over it, you can see the arrow kind of appears out of nowhere and moves over into place. It's a really simple effect, but it's really effective and I quite enjoy it. While you can use generate blocks and Kadence at the same time, I don't think it's the best workflow. So let me give you a couple examples of what I mean. Just to set things up, I'm gonna go ahead and add a section in here. First, we'll go ahead and add a generate blocks headline. We'll say GB headline. Now, if I wanted to change the size and the color and the spacing of this, I would do this using all the generate blocks controls I'm used to. So for instance, we could change the size to 25 pixels. We could go here and change the color to red. And maybe we could say we want some top margin of like 40 pixels just to exaggerate. And let's say that's exactly what I want. Now, if we go in here and add another headline, and this time we'll use Kadence's headlines, which is under advanced text, we can do Kadence headline. And let me get this moved into my container like I have. And we can do all the same things. Kadence has all these same controls, but you can see everything here on the right looks completely different than how it looked inside of generate blocks. They're using two completely different systems, which sometimes can slow you down having to remember where all the settings are located. For example, I know my color's right here. I changed my font size to, I think, 25 pixels. And then I added top margin, which here is an advanced margin top. And let's see, those are their default settings. I think we can change this to values here, so 40 pixels. So I ended up with the exact same headlines, but it just took me down a different path to make it happen. This can get really confusing when you have different sections, different headings, different buttons. All of these elements won't be styled using the exact same method. So whenever I can, I try to avoid having both of them, but it's no secret that Kadence has a lot more blocks than generate blocks does. I'm used to working in generate blocks. It's not that it's better or worse. It's just really what you're used to, and it speeds up your workflow when you're able to use the same interface all the time instead of having to switch back and forth. There seems to be a lot of confusion on when to use Flexbox or when to use the grid block. Now the truth is you could use either one of these layouts, but I'm going to give you kind of some ideas on where I tend to use one versus the other. So the first thing we're going to look at is some macro layouts, some bigger layouts like columns inside of a section. First, we'll do this using Flexbox. So what I can do is go ahead and add a container. We'll change this display to Flex, and inside of it, we'll go ahead and add a couple more containers. So if we open up the list view, we can see we have our Flex container here with our 3 columns inside of it. Of course, by default, these are only the width of the content that's in them, and they're empty right now, so technically they're 0 pixels wide. So what we'll do is go ahead and grab all 3 of these containers, and under Flex Child, we'll set the Flex Grow to 1. This will make sure these 3 columns fill up equal amount of space. We could also go in here to our Flex container and change the gap to something like 40 pixels. Now we had to do quite a few clicks there, but it does get us the 3-column layout we were after. Where I run into some problems with this is, let's say we want to go down on tablet, we just want 2 columns. So now we have to go back to this Flex container. We have to make sure that we have wrap turned on. These are automatically getting their width based on just how much they can grow, but at this point we want them to be 50%, so we're gonna have to select all 3 again. We can turn the grow off, and we can change the sizing to 50%, but because we have the gap on the Flex container, it's actually 50% plus the gap. So we'd have to go back here and change that gap to 0. Now they're 50-50 next to each other, but we need to find another way to space them out. All of this is possible with Flexbox, and we could get this working just the way we want. But for me, something like this is just a whole lot easier using the grid block. For example, I can just type in grid. I can add a 3-column grid. I can change the gap here. And when we go to tablet, I can open this up, and all 3 of these containers, I can just change them to 50%. Of course, we need our vertical gap as well to match. But for me, that's just a whole lot quicker for doing some of these big layouts. It does end up giving you one more DOM element. You have the grid block in here where you didn't have that in the flex setting, but honestly, this isn't gonna make any kind of difference inside of your performance scores. And for me, it just speeds up the development process so much more that I think it's worth it. Now, it's worth mentioning here that using CSS Grid is actually my preferred method for doing these kind of layouts, but we don't have those controls inside of Generate Blocks, at least not yet, but I'm hoping it's on the way. Keep in mind that the grid block inside Generate Blocks doesn't use CSS Grid. Even though they both have the word grid in them, it's not really using CS Grid, it's more using Flexbox controls. I know that can be super confusing, and I do mention using grid in here, but when I'm referencing that, I'm talking about using the grid block inside Generate Blocks. Now, there are situations where I really do prefer Flexbox to using the grid block, and that's for more micro layouts. Let's say we have these different cards here, and at the bottom of each card, we want to have a picture and a name, like the author of this post or this course or whatever it may be. Let's go ahead and start with the grid block this time. So we'll go down here to this second layout where we're going to explore the grid block. Inside of this column, I can type grid and add my grid. We want 2 columns, so I'll just grab this 2 column layout. Inside here, we want an image, so we'll add an image. We'll go to our media library. I have a picture of me uploaded. And here next to it, we want my name. So we'll just say Kyle Van Deusen. Now, this image is too big, obviously, so we can make this smaller by just changing the width to maybe like 80 pixels. But now this column's still taking up the full width. So we'll have to go down here and make sure that our width setting instead of 50% is just zeroed out. Now it will only take the width of its content. We can go to the grid here and vertically align it to the center. And we can give it just a little bit of gap. And we've got a pretty good setup here. Now, for me, that works just fine, but I really don't think the grid block is necessary in this little layout. For me, it'd be much easier to just go in here and add a container. We'll add our image. Change its size to 80 pixels. We'll go ahead and add my name. And we can just grab this container and change the display to flex. That will put them next to each other, align the items, and give it just a little bit of gap. And for me, this micro layout, it's a whole lot easier with Flexbox than it is adding the complexity of the grid block. Now, for me, this took some experimenting and finding out where am I using Flex, where am I using the grid block. And it's not a hard and fast rule that micro and macro layouts, but for general purposes, the bigger layouts, I will still use the grid block, where the smaller, more fine detail layouts, I will use Flexbox. Hopefully you learned something new inside this video. If you did, let me know which trick inside of here was something new to you. I'm gonna try to do a better job in the future of making notes of all the different questions you guys ask inside the comments, so I can compile some more videos like this in the future where we can go through a lot of tips and tricks all inside of one video. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so when those videos do come out, you get notified of them. If you'd like to see some other videos I've done in the past, I got a couple cards popping up here. You can check those out. And if you'd like to come hang out with us, you can join over 7,000 other website professionals inside the Admin Bar community using the link down in the description.